Welcome to Kambali 2020, a Rebuild Bali festival. I'm Janet Deneef, the founder and director, and today I'm really excited to be presenting Kwe Mai Phan Nguyen. I'll just tell you a bit about her before we start our conversation. She was born in a small village in North Vietnam and in 1973 and migrated with her family to the Mekong Delta, South Vietnam, when she was 6. But it was a scholarship in Melbourne, Australia that was the turning point of her life. And as she said herself, she might otherwise have been working in a rice field if not for that opportunity. So when she returned, she worked for several UN agencies, etc., began research. She's worked with veterans and war victims. She has a master's in creative writing and a PhD. So her latest book, which we're talking about today, is The Mountains Sing. It's her first novel. She's otherwise known as a poet, etc. She's going to show you the cover. She's written many other books, actually, poetry, etc. She's a legend. It's the first book she has written in English, and she only learnt English from the 8th grade. So that's a pretty major achievement. I take my hat off to you to be able to do that. And she has become the first Vietnamese citizen whose novel in English is published to international acclaim. So great achievement. But let's just read some of the reviews, etc. The New York Times review said, Kwe Mai contains her saga with a poet's discipline, crafting spare and unsparing sentences, and uplifts it with a poet's antenna for beauty. In the most desolate circumstances, she evokes the landscape hauntingly as a sight of loss so profound it assumes the quality of fable. And she's enjoyed many other best-selling accolades: New York Times Editor's Choice, Indie Bestseller, USA Today Most Popular Debut Novel, a Book Rights Best Book, and also Best Historical Fiction Book by BuzzFeed Books and Goodreads. And Kwe Mai, lucky for us, lives in Jakarta. So welcome to our session. I'm really excited to be interviewing you today.
Thank you so much, Janet, for having me. It's such a great honor to be speaking with you. I'm a great fan of the Ubud Writers and Readers Festival. I remember being there last year and I was so moved by the atmosphere and the quality of the discussions and of how many authors you were able to bring together. It's a pity that we have to do it virtually this year, but I think it's a great way to connect people, and I think people need this, to come together.
Yeah, and we'll be back next year, so don't worry. So let's start talking about your book. It has been called an epic account of Vietnam's painful 20th century history. It traces many major historical events, from the Great Hunger to land reform, the Vietnam War, which of course is my generation. So tell us a bit about yourself and why did you choose to write this epic novel?
So, I was born in a small village in the north of Vietnam and then later on moved to the south. And, my experiences in both parts of Vietnam and of my work in different regions of Vietnam highlighted to me the impact of historical events on the lives of Vietnamese people. And I realized that a lot of our stories face the risk of being forgotten. So I wanted to document it because I think, as Grandma Diệu Lan said, if our stories survive, we will live on regardless of whether our bodies are here on this earth or not. And when I travel to my parents' villages and I talk to the older people, I think they hold so much of our history within them. And I'm very afraid that when they pass away, these stories would be lost. And Vietnam has a great tradition of storytelling. I think our survival depended on the traditions of storytelling. And I'm a bit sad that nowadays we develop too fast. We move on too fast and we don't listen to the elders anymore. And And this book is one of my efforts to hang on to that storytelling tradition, to encourage the younger generation to listen more to their parents and grandparents. And if you talk to any Vietnamese family, you know, what they have gone through can be written into an epic novel. So you know, and from early on, I wanted to use a story to represent Vietnam and how the war and different historical events divided us. And the concept of brothers and sisters fighting against each other and killing each other is so profound, and it's the truth in Vietnam, you know. So many families were separated by the war and fought against each other during the war, and I wanted to bring that up in this book.
So at what point did you decide to write it, and what sort of research and how long did the research take?
So I think I've been researching for this book all my life, you know. So because from early on, I wanted to be a writer. When we moved from the north to the south of Vietnam, it was just after the war, and Vietnam had been divided into two. So it was like I felt like a refugee in another country. You know, we spoke a different dialect. We were I was bullied at school and at, you know, where I lived, and I found friendship books, and books really rescued me. And I found, you know, I felt the power of storytelling, and I wanted to be a writer. And so I was listening to people, and I wrote, you know, almost every day in my diary. But because I was so interested in the human story, so I was note taking some of the things that I was listening to and I was witnessing. But I think only in 2012, when I was in Manila, that I had a chance to study creative writing for the first time. So I did my Master of Creative Writing at with the UK's Lancaster University. So I was working on another novel at that time. I was trying to to write my first novel in English. And then one day I was traveling in a car with a friend to a kickpop shop, self-defense class, which I talk about in the book. I in the car, I asked this Vietnamese friend, you know, where he was during the war. And he told me that in 1972, when Hanoi was bombed, he was in the capital city with his grandma, because his parents had gone to Russia, to work. So he was alone there with his grandma, and his grandma protected him from the bombs. And his story was so moving, because he said, he described to me in detail how all of the bomb shelters were full, and they were running from one after another trying to find a shelter, and it was all full, and how scared he was. And he told me that more than 20 years later, when he got a job and his boss sent him on a business trip, and he got onto the plane, and when the engine of the plane started, he had such a vivid flashback of the bombing that he was screaming. He wanted, he was screaming, and he had to run out of the airplane. And I looked at him, he's Buddhist, and he's very calm. And, and then I thought about the trauma that all of us had to bury, because for Vietnamese culture, there's not, there has not been a lot of research done in Vietnam about trauma. So people who are traumatized are often seen as possessed by ghosts. So they are very much stigmatized and discriminated against. So I felt the need also to document the trauma and to highlight the impact of trauma on family and on society. And to highlight the consequences of war, because war and conflicts do not just kill people, they devastate us for generations to come, and they destroy nature. In the mountain scene, I talk about how Agent Orange and the bombs, how it destroyed nature and also our culture and the fabrics of society. So the cost of war is just tremendous.
Mm. And so yourself, how old were you during the Vietnam War? Do you have any memories yourself?
So I was born in 1973, so 2 years before the war ended. So I grew up, I remember growing up in a village emptied of men. So most of the men had gone to war and few came back, and those who came back, were missing their limbs or they had left a part of their soul in the battlefield. And I remember the women who stood waiting in front of their house day after day. And every afternoon I would see these women, they had come home from the field, they had cooked and fed their kids, and they would spend the afternoon, the late afternoon, evening waiting for their husband or father. And I, as a small child, I loved flying kites on the village dike, and I saw these women standing motionless. And when we moved to the south of Vietnam, I saw these women again. The women in the south of Vietnam waited for the men who were missing in the war and the men who were put into re-education camps, because in the south people fought, for the Americans against the Northern Army. So that's why I wanted to write about these women. And I was haunted by the fact that there were so many bomb craters everywhere. When we went by train from north to south of Vietnam, I saw craters. There were so many of them. And I wrote in the Mountain Sing, they look just like footprints of gigantic flocks of animals that rushed through the earth and leaving their footprints behind. And when I was little in my village in the north of Vietnam, when I played hide and seek, I hid under the bamboo range of our family, and in the bomb shelter my grandpa had dug to hide away from the French. And I was there. I could feel the war all around me. It was, I think it was, a lot of it was carried on and passed on to us, and it was a silent kind of passing. We were not aware that we were inheriting those trauma. And I think, all around me there was also a lot of violence, as manifestation of trauma, but people couldn't talk about it openly.
I just, there's a lot of nature that works its way throughout the story, which is lovely, because I think when we think of Asia, we think of absolutely breathtaking landscapes. But I wanted to ask you, this is your lovely book cover, The Mountains Sing. So what is the significance of that title?
So at the beginning of the book, so my book is told in the voices of two women, Grandma Diệu Lan and her granddaughter Hương. And at the beginning of the book, Grandma Diệu Lan told the granddaughter, the challenges faced by Vietnamese people are as tall as the tallest mountains. So, the image of the mountains represent the challenges faced by the Vietnamese. The mountain sings represent, I think, the sense of hope, the sense of courage, resilience demonstrated by Vietnamese people throughout our history. But the mountains also represent the division. Within our history, we were divided because our country was cut into three parts at first by the French. And then, in 1954, it was divided into the north and the south again. And then, our family and community still a lot of families and the Vietnamese community are still very much divided today because of our perspective on the war. So the mountains represent the divisions, and also the mountain sing is the name of the bird, which represents the symbol of hope for Hương in the novel. So what happened is that Hương father went to war, and during the war, as he trekked through the jungles, he missed his daughter, so he carved a wooden bird. And the name of the bird is called Sơn Ca, which can be translated as the mountains sing. So the mountain sing is also the name of the bird that Hương holds on to throughout the rest of her life. as she waits for her father to return.
So the bird almost became like a symbol of peace, or like the dove. Yeah, I mean, there really is a strong thread of hope through the book, and that's obviously something that you wanted to show. Yeah, that despite everything, there's an extraordinary resilience and hope, and there is a way ahead. Yeah.
And also kindness. I think Grandma Diệu Lan talked in the mountain saying, in difficult times, people are kind. And I think kindness and hope are the two pillars that helped us to survive throughout our turbulent history. And I think, even nowadays, in our most desperate circumstances, if we don't have hope, we don't have anything left. And I just want to pass on the spirit of hope to the reader. I mean, my parents went through so much. So my mother was, she was orphaned of her parents since a very young age. But you talk to her. My husband asked me the other day, who laughs most in our family? So I was saying, you or our son. And then he said, your mother. And it's so true. She often laughs, and she laughs out loud. And she has the most satisfactory, she laughs in such a every way. And she has been through a lot. You cannot believe her life. How terrible, how many terrible things she witnessed and had to survive. She's very hopeful.
She's a survivor, yes. I mean, you talked about the tragedies. There's also, you mentioned in the book, there's the Great Hunger and the land reform. I mean, really tragic times.
So, these are real events that I documented in the novel in a fictional way. So the Great Hunger of 1945 is a consequence of World War II. So approximately 2 million Vietnamese people died during that time when Vietnam was occupied by both the Japanese and the French. And this historical event is not sufficiently documented. People don't know about it. So my family actually lost 3 members in that terrible, period. So my father's mother died together with her youngest son and her brother. So because so many people in our village died that there were few people left to bury them. So the person who buried the 3, my grandma and her brother and her son, the person who buried them could not remember their grave because he buried so many people. So later on, my aunt had to use the help of a fortune teller to
yeah, same as Bali. Wow. Okay.
Tradition of beliefs, and I wrote about fortune tellers in my book because I had incredible experiences with fortune tellers. And I did not believe in fortune telling at first, but some of them are so good.
Alive and kicking here, that's for sure. Yeah. Wow, that's so interesting. But tell us a bit more about the land reform, because these are things I was certainly not aware of also.
So the land reform is also very rarely documented, it has been documented by a few Vietnamese writers, but normally it's not allowed to be published in Vietnam. So people have to, recently there's a book by Nguyễn Quang Lộc, a very famous novelist. So he wrote this novel called Kiến Chuột và Ruồi, Ants, Rats and Flies. So it's about the land reform in the middle region of Vietnam, but he could not publish it inside Vietnam, even though he wrote it in Vietnamese. So he had to publish it in the States with a small Vietnamese publisher. So, but in English, so little has been written about it except for the work of Dương Thu Hương, Paradise of the Blind. But I wanted to document, how it impacted on villagers, how the consequences had, because people who faced persecution in the land reform later on, they carried that that dark mark in their family history. So people have to lie about that history until
Yes.
today. So
Yeah.
it's a very sad event, and
Mm.
I mean the saddest thing is that it turned family members against each other. It evoked a lot of hatred and anger, and villagers, you know, like they turn against each other. So the consequences are just tremendous.
You mentioned, this is Huang saying about her grandmother. As the war continued, it was grandma's stories that kept me going and kept my hopes alive. Tell us about the importance of the grandma in the story. I mean, apart from the fact that there's a lot of really strong women in the story, I mean, there's obviously something special for you about grandma.
So, you know, growing up, I was very jealous of my friends who had grandmas because I had none. Both of my grandmas had died before I was born. So my father's mother died in the Great Hunger, and my mother's mother died because of childbirth. And we have no pictures of them. I don't know
Oh.
how they look like, and and because my parents were very young, so they don't remember about their mothers either. They don't remember much. So I have to imagine a lot about their lives, you know. So I talked to a lot of older women and I imagined their lives, and I was determined as a young when I wanted to be a writer, I told myself one day I'm going to write a book with a grandmother in it. You know? So when my friend told me the bombing of Hanoi, immediately I imagined my grandmother protecting me from the bomb.
Same way.
So then I put myself in the position of Hương and my grandma in the position of Grandma Diệu Lan. So I imagined how it was for her. But actually, you know, what Grandma Diệu Lan went through in the Great Hunger, in the land reform, how she had to leave her kids one after another as she tried to escape, is based on the real experiences of my friend's grandmother. So during the land reform in the north of Vietnam, my friend's grandmother was condemned as a landowner. So her brother was killed, and overnight she had to escape with her kids. So she had too many kids and no money and no resources. So she had to leave one child with a stranger along the way, and similar to what happened to Grandma Diệu Lan in the novel. So it's just so heartbreaking. And my friend's grandma made it to Hanoi. So in reality, she did not know anyone. She just knocked at the gate of a French family. So that happened in 1953 when some of the French were still in Vietnam. And so the French family accepted her as their servant. They did not know that she had come from the countryside because she could speak French. Even though she was a farmer, she read a lot of books, she was educated. So in reality, my friend's grandma worked as a servant, and when the family went back to France, when France was defeated in the Battle of Điện Biên Phủ in 1945, the French family had to leave and went back to Paris. So they offered her to come with them. So she said, no, I can't. She did not tell them about her kids. She just accepted the money they gave her, and then she ventured back into these villages and collected her kids.
Oh my goodness gracious me. It's extraordinary, that sense of survival. Tell us about, you talked about the division in families. I mean, apart from the fact that you've got the division in the country, you've got the war, people fighting each other, but obviously within families, there were political divisions, religious divisions. How does that, how does it work today even? Do those divisions still exist?
Very much so. They are the diasporic Vietnamese who went by, who had to become boat people and left Vietnam. Many of them lost so much. They lost their livelihood, they lost their houses, they lost a lot of family members. So they are very bitter and angry, and they don't want to come back to Vietnam. and some of them tell their kids not to come back, and I understand how painful it is, because today in Vietnam, sometimes the propaganda is too much, because in the textbook, the people who fought against the Northern Vietnamese army are still called Nguyen, like in the book, the illegitimate, or the puppet of the Americans, so there's still a lot of discrimination against the people who once, who were on the other side of the war. So I think, when it comes to reconciliation, it's very difficult among the Vietnamese. Reconciliation is a topic which has been widely discussed among Vietnam and the United States, among the veteran groups. And I think a lot of Australian veterans have come back to Vietnam, and they feel very much welcome. But when it comes to Vietnamese people ourselves, there's still a lot of harsh feelings, and that's why I wanted to put the Vietnamese people in the center stage, to show both sides, of the suffering. And I think, one of our very famous poets, Nguyễn Duy, he wrote this a poem, and it said, nói cho cùng, trong mỗi cuộc chiến tranh, bên nào thắng thì nhân dân đều bại. It means in every war, whoever wins, the people lose. It's the people always lose. I mean, regardless of who wins the war. So I wanted to talk about the human cost of this war and how it impacted on families and on community.
So why did you choose, do you think, to have women and girls mainly in the story or telling the story instead of men, actually? Because I guess we do tend to hear war stories from a man's perspective, but in this case it's really a women's tale.
Yes, because I have been reading a lot of literature about Vietnam, and sometimes when I came across fiction from white writers, male writers about Vietnam, and the representation of Vietnamese women in this type of work is sometimes it upsets me a lot, because Vietnamese women are seen normally as prostitutes, as people who need to be rescued, as victims, as uncomplex and absent of trauma. And growing up in Vietnam and being surrounded by Vietnamese women who made mistakes in their life, but who had to kind of struggle every day or go on. I wanted to show the strength and the complexity of these women. So that's why I chose to have women characters in my book, because so much had been written about men, and I think in the Vietnamese society, Vietnamese women have such an important role. For example, we have the tale of the Trung sisters, who led the Vietnamese armies to rise up against the Chinese invaders. So this happened a long time ago, and the images of them are grand because they ride on elephants. They ride on elephants, and they are followed by many men, and going forward to defeat the Chinese. So if you go to Vietnam, there are streets named after them, Hai Ba Trung, the Trung sisters, and they are the legends,
And tell us about, you mentioned Agent Orange before. I mean, that's something we all heard about from the Vietnam War. So how real was that effect on the people?
The effect of Agent Orange is still devastating until today. Growing up in the Mekong Delta, my family survived on the fish or the shrimp we could catch. And sometimes we would catch disfigured fish, fish that were twisted and had two tails. And I think because, and then, we heard people telling us don't eat it because it's the impact of Agent Orange, because, the army dumped a lot of it on rivers and on forests, and everything gathered into, the water source, and that affected the fish. That
Mm-hmm.
and because we were so poor, so we had to eat it. And I was thinking I was eating the war, you know. And for a while, I was kind of worried because when I visited, you know, the Agent Orange victims, I could see the terrible impact. And you know, I had to write about Agent Orange because for quite a few years, I volunteered to help victims of Agent Orange in Hanoi. There's a village where there are hundreds of children who are victims of Agent Orange, and they have all types of disability, and including mental disability as well. And it's devastating because their families are just too poor. And you know, like in the US, you know, the companies or the army have acknowledged the negative impact of Agent Orange, so they compensate the veterans. But for Vietnamese victims, we have received nothing. So there have been court cases against the companies that produced Agent Orange, and the companies who kept saying it was harmless to people. You know, so that's why I wrote in that book, and that's a true story that a veteran told me, that when they were, you know, walking through the jungle, when the Agent Orange was being sprayed onto them, their commander said, pee onto a handkerchief and put it against your nose, you'll be fine.
Talking about children, you mentioned the other day about the illegitimate children that had no parents in the end. You mentioned, you know, orphanages full of other children fathered by American soldiers, etc.
So this is the next book project I'm writing about. I have finished drafting another novel called. So this novel is about, you know, children of American soldiers and Vietnamese women born and abandoned during the Vietnam War. So you know, like it's terrible when you know, it started as from my real life experience. I grew up in Bạc Liêu, a small town in the south, in the Mekong Delta, and in my on my street there were several mixed children, and they were not allowed. They were not able to go to school with us, so they were bullied and called all types of names. So we call them, you know, children of the enemy, you know, like go back to America, you don't belong here, you lost the war, all type of things. So I felt really bad for these kids. So then in the year 2015, I read an article of a veteran who went back to Vietnam with an album of old photos, looking for, you know, trying to look for the ex-girlfriends whose pictures were in the album. And he walked the streets of Saigon trying to find the girlfriend, because he had walked away from her when she was pregnant. So when, you know, he found someone who, and later on he found the son. But I was so moved by the fact that many of the veterans who are older now and who want to, you know, like I don't know, to go back into the past and undo some of their mistakes. So then I helped some of them find their kids, and actually we were successful in some cases, but the emotional trauma is tremendous, you know. I mean, what I found out about these Amerasians, what they had to go through, you know, during and after in Vietnam is just incredible. So I decided to document their experiences into another book.
You said that when you released The Mountain Sing, a lot of people approached you, Vietnamese, actually relieved that you did tell this story and sharing their stories, obviously moving stories with you. I mean, sounds like there were quite a few people that contacted you, yeah?
I received almost, you know, like I've received so many messages. messages of a younger generation of diasporic Vietnamese who told me they knew so little about the history of it, of their family.
Yeah.
Through this book, they were able to talk to their parents, and the parents told them similar stories of the land reform, of the Great Hunger, of the things that happened to their family. And also, I received a lot of letters also from veterans who told me that, you know, they were in their training, they were told that don't worry to kill the Vietnamese because they are good, they are, you know, they are subhumans, they're not like us. So, you know, I think that's the danger of war. We dehumanize the other side so that it's easier to kill the other side. So they told me, you know, this book helps them to put faces to the people whom they met during the war. And I think that's important to highlight that we are all humans, regardless of where we come from and what we've been through. You know, we are more similar than we are different.
So many writers that I've met over the years have written about their homeland. But when they've been away, do you think this is a book that you could have written in Vietnam? I imagine you were in other places. You've lived in Australia, Bangladesh, Philippines, Belgium, and now Indonesia. This must have been a book that you wrote outside of Vietnam, and could you have written this in Vietnam?
I think being away from home makes you more homesick, makes you yearn for your homeland much more. So you have to bring your homeland. You have to make the homeland alive in your mind. So, you know, I had to write, when I write about food, I have to make it so alive so that I can taste it, I can smell it. I have to imagine the landscape. So in a way, it you know, it demands you to make it more vivid and more real. And I think being a writer in Vietnam is quite tough. You know, I mean, because the Vietnamese society puts a lot of burden on women. We are supposed to go to work every day and take care of the family. So, you know, for me to stay home and write, people would be like, are you unemployed? You know, like, because a writer in Vietnam, you know, people don't normally think being a writer is having a job. So so it's like everybody writes, so it's like more like a hobby than a real job. So I think my parents would be calling me and saying, why are you not going to work? You were educated in Australia.
Yeah, true. I can imagine that. Yes.
You know, in the beginning, you mentioned about how the scholarship to Australia turned my life around. And the other day I woke up and I was thinking about Australia, and I was crying because when I went to, you know, before going to Australia, I had one set of pants and two t-shirts. You know, I did not have anything. I was, most of the time I went to bed hungry because I did not have anything to eat. And you know, I don't know, and this scholarship gave me such tremendous chance, you know, to study, to, you know, also I love the fact that I was surrounded by knowledge, you know, by stories, because like the libraries in Australia was just so amazing. You know, coming from Vietnam at that time, we had very few libraries in our library. I don't think I could go into a library at that time. And to be in Australia, to be surrounded by books, and you know, books that were not, you know, there was no censorship. And you know, and how Australia, you know, I admire the fact that Australia was so open to talk about your difficult past, you know. That encouraged me to look deeper into my difficult past, my nation's difficult past, and deal with it rather than avoid it.
And you said that once you were studying, you actually took some other day jobs, and sent your money home to help the family.
Yes, so because my parents were in that, when I went to Australia. So I worked as a dishwasher for restaurants, and I worked as cashier, and I stocked things up in the market shelves.
Yes, yes, yes.
I cleaned people's home, but I was very, very fortunate, to be living with an Australian family. After, I had to study English for 1 year, and after the first year, I was able to, to come and stay with an Australian family, the Russell family, Jim and Suzanne. They were just amazing, and they showed me so many things about the Australian culture, and I learned so much English from them. When I first came, I could not understand anything.
I can imagine. Yeah, I can understand that. So, how important do you think it is for writers to write these stories? I mean, obviously, yours is kind of a fresh story for a lot of people. How important is it for you to do this?
I think it's important for us to have the courage to write about the truth. And I don't know, sometimes I envy writers from country who don't have to have issues with censorship or with forbidden things. I really envy this type of freedom. And I mean, in writing this story, I appreciate the struggle of writers from countries who have to fight.
Yes, they believe in
their stories told. Not only fight against the against the publishing world, but fight against themselves. First of all, you have to overcome your own fears. You have to overcome your own barriers, because the tendency is to censor yourself. And how to gain that type of freedom so that you can tell the stories the way your imagination can take you. And once you limit yourself and limit your imagination, it cannot be the best stories that you can tell.
And we're talking about censorship. Is your book on sale in Vietnam?
Yes, it's on sale in English now. But I mean, the Vietnamese publishing industry is tightly controlled. So for a book to appear in a bookshop, it has to be approved by the Ministry of Culture and Information. So any important book, they have to have it approved. So I mean, there's no physical copies of my book, but people can buy the Kindle. And I have seen emails, people passing around PDF copies of my book, and I'm just so upset. Because I think that happens. I think people should support more, writers, and respect, copyright.
Sorry, I'm just I just got a battery message. So tell me about living in Jakarta. You said that how long have you been living there, and what are the similarities between Vietnam and Jakarta?
I have been here for 3 years, and before coming here, I asked my friend who were in Indonesia at that time, and she said, Indonesian are the most friendly people in the world, the most beautiful people in the world. And I had just been, we just finished our posting in the Philippines at that time, and the Filipinos are just so amazing. And I thought they could be, people cannot be more friendly. But here it's just so amazing. I think I feel at home in a way, how warm people are, how, I love about the way of life in Indonesia, because you can see everything on the street. So, a lot of life is out there on the street, ceremonies or even gathering, people sit on the pavement to talk, or even, have party. And I love that kind of atmosphere. And, a lot of vegetation remind me of Vietnam as well. the fruit and vegetable is very similar to Vietnam. So the plants, I mean, there were plants that I did not see since my childhood, and I found them here in Indonesia, and it's just so amazing.
And what about the food? Are there any overlaps with the food?
The food is quite different. The Indonesian food is more spicy, I could think, but you use similar ingredients like a lot of lemongrass, ginger. Vietnamese, we also use that, but I think we use less. So I think, but I think the similarities are that we use a lot of fresh ingredients in our cooking, right?
Yeah, it's fantastic.
And the cooking takes quite long.
Yeah, it was one of my favorite cuisines, I have to admit. I'm crazy about it. So getting back to the grandma, you mentioned that one of grandma's quotes was, if you bear grudges, you're the one who will have to bear the burden of sorrow. Do you think this is a message through the book as well?
Definitely.
It's about what you carry with you. Yeah.
When I wrote about the Great Hunger and about wicked ghosts, actually wicked ghosts represent someone who killed my grandma in real life. So in the Great Hunger, my grandma ventured into a cornfield and tried to steal corn for her children. And she was arrested. She was captured by the guard of the cornfield, and he tied her up onto corn plants, and she was too weak to break away. So when my father told me the story, I hated the man. I wished so many bad things on him, and I was determined to write a book that show how he was punished, and I wanted to wish so many bad things on his family. But then I found forgiveness instead. And I found the gift of forgiveness, because that's the best thing you can give yourself. Because I think, a consequence of violence is that we don't forgive each other. We carry the hatred, and we, like violence, we continue it. We take revenge, and then we keep killing other people, and this circle of violence never stops unless we all say, we put a stop. We need to start to love humans more, and talk to each other more, look into the concept of forgiveness more.
And there's a bit of a love story at the end, which does leave the book on a lovely note. Do you want to tell us a bit about that one?
I don't want to reveal too much.
That's true.
But I think, I'm crazy for romantic love stories.
I sort of wondered if the character was you in a way. I felt that Huang was a bit like you.
Yes, a bit like me in a way that like
she loved reading.
Of me growing up, people, it's like it's a big deal to go out with someone of the opposite sex, and if you hold hand already, it's already a big deal.
Yes.
This type of, and I was always dreaming for a love story that is everlasting. This is loyal. Like when I was growing up, I foresaw true love as something that happened once in your life. But when you are so young, and then you love until the end of your life. So this story of Hương and Tâm is just the symbol of that pure love, and it's the love for literature that brings them together. And their common vision about war, and that humans don't need war, and war shouldn't take place, and the concept of free trading as a right for people. So they shared those common visions and the love for literature, and that brought them together. It's not just the physical attraction, but it
was their shared pleasure. And proverbs. I love the way that you weave proverbs throughout the book. Are they part of your like Vietnamese wisdom? Are they a strong part of your lives there?
Definitely, in Vietnam, we talk in proverbs, So, for example, if I'm upset about something, and then my mother would say, trong cái rủi có cái may. Bad luck hides inside, and good luck hides inside bad luck. She would say that, or or like Grandma Ziolan said, when they try to convince Uncle Sam, to change, and then Grandma Ziolan said, mưa dầm thấm lâu, soft and persistent rain penetrates the earth better than a storm. And it's so true, because like in real life, we, if you get upset, it doesn't work. If you persistent and you show love in a gentle way, people can change. And I think this is the Indonesian way. Yeah, people don't get
true. Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. So is there any other thing you'd like to say about your book before we finish up? I mean, I must say it's been a fantastic interview. I've loved getting to know more about your story, but is there anything you'd like to close up with?
So I showed you before 2 different covers
Yes.
of my books.
Yep.
It's the US Canada
okay.
edition, and this is the
I hadn't seen that one.
Australia, New Zealand edition, and it's being translated into many languages as well. So I'm really
well done. Well done.
So I just want to say thank you so much to all the readers from so many different countries who have shown love and support for my book.
It's been fantastic.
A dream come true. And I mean, I wrote this book with the dictionary.
Oh, well, you did really well. I mean, there's no way I could write in Indonesian.
Sometimes, now I'm working on the second novel, and sometimes, because I think in Vietnamese, the complex things, I still think in Vietnamese, and I have to convert it into English, and it's so hard. And I have to turn to the dictionary and have to work around it, and you don't have a feeling whether this phrase is natural or not. With you, if I write in Vietnamese, I know instantly.
Exactly what to say. Yes, absolutely.
Because it's natural, and I can invent things, and I know that it's not odd. But it can be really odd or funny, and I wouldn't know. But I think it's about learning, so I'm trying to learn.
Yes.
And I think. And I think I'm just grateful for the encouragement of readers out there. Like I often receive messages from readers like, "When is your next book? We want to read."
Lovely. There you go. You got a ready audience. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, and best of luck. And I do hope everybody buys a copy, because I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I think I enjoyed it even more because I know you, and I could certainly hear your voice through the story. And I think that's what makes that kind of journey so special, when there's such a personal voice. So thank you, Quay Mai, and all the best with this book and with the next book. I hope you enjoy as much success as you have with The Mountain Sings. So thank you. Terima kasih.
Thank you so much, Janet. You are just, I love your questions, and thank you so much for the time that you spend with my book and me. And I hope, great success for this year's Ubud Writers and Readers.
Thank you.
It's one of the best festivals in the world, and I'm a great fan. Thank you.
And I look forward to seeing you in Jakarta. Yeah.
Thank you. And see you soon.
Yeah. Thank you. Bye. Ciao, ciao.
Ciao.